It was a strange day. The air was warmer than usual for a Boston winter. People walked along Commercial Street, just going about their lives. They had no idea what was coming. They could not imagine the wave that was about to change everything. This was not a wave of water from the ocean. This was something different, something thick, dark, and sweet. It was a wave of molasses, a river of brown syrup suddenly set free. It moved with a terrible power, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground. For a moment the world seemed to stop, and then it just exploded in chaos. Panic filled the air. People screamed. There was nowhere to run. A police officer, Patrolman Frank McManus, tried to send a message. He grabbed his call box and shouted, "Send all available rescue vehicles and personnel. There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." His voice was filled with disbelief. How could this be real? A sticky brown tsunami in the middle of a city. It was a scene from a nightmare, not from a normal Wednesday afternoon. The wave was not just liquid, it was a moving wall, carrying pieces of the giant steel tank that had held it captive just moments before. The wave crashed into buildings. It tore them from their foundations. The sound was deafening, a loud roar mixed with the cracking of wood and the twisting of metal. It was a sound of pure destruction. Horses, strong animals used to pulling heavy carts, were caught in the sticky tide. They struggled, but the molasses was too strong, too thick. It was a trap, made of sugar. People were knocked off their feet, pulled under the surface of the dark, suffocating liquid. The world had turned upside down in an instant, and everything was covered in a deadly, sweet goo. Imagine being there. One moment, you are walking to lunch. The next, a shadow falls over you. It is not a cloud. It is a 25-foot-high wall of molasses. It moves with a strange, horrifying purpose. You try to run, but your feet feel heavy. The air is thick with a smell that is both sweet and sickening. This was the reality for the people of Boston's North End on January 15, 1919. A simple, everyday substance had become a monster, a force of nature unleashed by human error, a sticky wave that would leave a permanent mark on the city and its soul. How fast can a person run? An average person might run about 15 miles per hour for a short distance. A truly fast athlete might reach speeds over 25 miles per hour. But the wave of molasses was faster. Scientists and engineers later calculated its speed. At its peak, the wave moved at an astonishing 35 miles per hour. It was a sprint that no one could win. This was not a slow ooze like syrup on a pancake. This was a violent, explosive force. The pressure inside the tank had built up until it was like a bomb going off, launching the molasses like a cannonball. Think about that speed, 35 miles per hour. It is the speed of a car driving through a neighborhood. Now imagine that speed belonging to a wall of thick, heavy liquid. It hit with incredible force. It had the power to lift a railroad car right off its tracks. It could smash through the brick walls of a firehouse. When people saw it coming, their minds could barely understand what they were seeing. Their bodies simply could not move fast enough to escape. The molasses chased them down the street, a relentless predator made of sugar. The thickness of the molasses made it even more deadly. It was not like being hit by water, which might knock you over. This was like being hit by a moving wall of mud. It was heavy and dense. It clung to everything it touched. People were not just swept away, they were engulfed. The sticky mass filled their lungs, making it impossible to breathe. It was a cruel and unusual kind of drowning, trapped in a substance that is usually a source of sweetness and comfort. The physics of the disaster were simple but brutal, immense weight moving at high speed, creating a force that nothing could withstand. So the people in its path were doomed. They ran, but the wave ran faster. They tried to find high ground, but the wave rose up to meet them. It was a terrifying race against a substance that should have been harmless. The disaster teaches us a powerful lesson. Even the most ordinary things can become dangerous when the conditions are wrong. For the victims of that day, molasses was not a food. It was a monster. A swift, dark, and unstoppable force that turned a city neighborhood into a scene of unimaginable horror in a matter of seconds. Why was there so much molasses in Boston? Why did a giant tank holding more than 2 million gallons of the stuff sit in the middle of a busy neighborhood? The answer is connected to a global conflict. It was connected to World War I. During the war, molasses was a key ingredient in making something very important, industrial alcohol. And industrial alcohol was a key ingredient in making weapons. It was used to produce munitions like smokeless gunpowder and dynamite. The war created a huge demand for it. The company that owned the tank was called the Purity Distilling Company. Its parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol, was a major player in the war effort. They would bring huge shipments of molasses from places like Cuba and Puerto Rico. The molasses would arrive by ship in Boston Harbor. Then, it would be stored in the giant tank on Commercial Street. From there, it was moved to a distillery in Cambridge. At the distillery, the molasses was fermented and distilled to create the industrial alcohol needed for the war machine. Boston was a vital link in this chain. The war had ended just 2 months before the disaster, in November 1918. But the demand for industrial alcohol was not gone. The era of prohibition was on the horizon. The 18th Amendment, which would ban the sale of alcoholic drinks, was close to being ratified. Many companies, including United States Industrial Alcohol, were rushing to produce as much beverage alcohol, like rum, as possible before the ban went into effect. They wanted to sell it legally while they still could. So, the tank was kept full, ready to turn that sweet molasses into profitable spirits. So this giant, dangerous tank sat in Boston for reasons of war and profit. It was a symbol of the industrial age, a massive container of raw material placed in a crowded area without much thought for the people living and working nearby. The people of the North End lived in the shadow of this tank, a silent giant filled with a substance tied to global events they might not have fully understood. They knew it was there, but they could not have known the danger it represented. It was a sweet secret that the city was keeping, and it was about to be revealed in the most tragic way possible. The tank was a monster waiting to be born. It was huge. It stood 50 feet tall and was 90 feet wide. It was built to hold nearly 2.5 million gallons of molasses. But it was built in a hurry. The company wanted it finished quickly to start profiting from the wartime demand for alcohol. The steel plates used to build it were thinner than the design called for. Safety tests that were standard procedure were skipped. No one filled the tank with water first to check for leaks. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a product of greed and haste. From the very beginning, the tank was not right. It groaned and rumbled. The people who lived and worked nearby could hear it. They grew used to the strange, unsettling sounds coming from the steel giant. It was like a living creature, moaning under the pressure of the millions of gallons of liquid inside. The tank also leaked. It was famous for it. Brown, sticky streams of molasses would ooze out from the seams between the steel plates. The company knew about the leaks. They just did not see them as a sign of a critical failure. Children in the neighborhood had a special relationship with the leaking tank. They would come with sticks and cups on warm days. They would collect the sweet molasses that dripped down its sides. For them, it was a source of free candy. It was a neighborhood quirk, a funny thing about the giant brown can that stood by the water. Their parents, however, were worried. They complained to the company about the constant leaks and the strange noises. They saw the dark stains running down the tank's side as a warning, but their concerns were ignored. The company's response was simple and careless. Instead of fixing the structural problems, they just painted the tank brown. This was to hide the dark streaks of leaking molasses. It was an attempt to cover up the problem, not to solve it. They were treating a deep structural wound as if it were just a cosmetic issue. Every day the pressure inside the tank stressed the weak steel. Every day the groans grew a little louder, the giant was in pain, and soon its pain would become the entire city's tragedy. The timeline of the disaster is chillingly precise. It happened on January 15, 1919. The day before, a new, warm shipment of molasses had been pumped into the tank. The tank was already nearly full of colder, denser molasses. Mixing the warm and cold liquid increased the pressure inside. The morning of the 15th was unusually mild for January, with the temperature rising above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This change in temperature caused the gas inside the tank to expand, adding even more stress to the already weak steel walls. The giant was reaching its breaking point. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, the moment came. There were no final warnings, just a sudden, terrible event. Eyewitnesses reported hearing a sound like machine gun fire. It was the sound of the steel rivets popping out of the tank's seams, one after another, in a rapid, deadly sequence. This was followed by a deep, rumbling roar. The ground shook as if a train was derailing right next to them. The massive steel tank, which had stood for over 3 years, was tearing itself apart. The pressure was just too much. The steel failed. In an instant, 2.3 million gallons of molasses were released. That is more than 14,000 tons of liquid. It erupted from the tank with explosive force. The wave it created was estimated to be 25 feet high at its peak, and it moved with incredible speed. It crashed outward in all directions, a tidal wave of syrup. It slammed into the firehouse of Engine 31, pushing the building off its foundation. It engulfed a city building and the stables of the paving division. It lifted a freight train car and threw it against the structure of the elevated railway. The entire event, from the first pop of the rivets to the wave crashing through the neighborhood, took only seconds. But in those few seconds, a part of Boston was completely destroyed. The world for those in the path of the flood turned from normal to catastrophic in the blink of an eye. The air was filled with the deafening roar of the wave and the screams of those caught within it. The sky was darkened by a spray of sticky brown liquid. A simple Wednesday lunch hour had become a moment of historic tragedy, all because a giant steel tank could no longer hold its sweet, deadly contents. In the middle of the chaos, there were stories of survival. There were voices that tell us what it was like. One survivor, a young boy named Anthony DiStasio, was walking home from school with his sisters. He was picked up by the wave and carried along, tumbling through the brown flood. He remembered seeing his sister call his name before she was pulled under. Miraculously, the wave threw him onto a rooftop, where he was later rescued. He lost his sister that day, but his memory gives us a personal glimpse into the terror of being caught in the sticky tide. Another voice belongs to Martin Claverty. He was sleeping in his home nearby when the tank burst. He was woken by the crash and the shaking of his house. The wave lifted his entire house and swept it down the street, crashing it into the elevated railway tracks. He was trapped inside, pinned by the wreckage. He managed to stay above the rising molasses by climbing onto a bed that was floating in the dark liquid. He was trapped for hours, listening to the sounds of destruction and the cries of others, before rescuers were able to reach him and pull him to safety. Not all stories ended in survival. George Lay, a firefighter at the nearby Engine 31 firehouse, was sitting down to lunch. The wave hit the firehouse with such force that it collapsed the building. Leahy was trapped under the wreckage, pinned by a collapsed wall. He was conscious but could not move. As the molasses slowly rose around him, he suffocated. His story is a heartbreaking reminder of how the disaster claimed its victims, slowly and cruelly. He was one of 21 people who lost their lives in the flood. These personal accounts are more powerful than any number or statistic. They paint a human picture of the disaster. They speak of loss, fear, and incredible luck. They show us people in the most extreme circumstances, fighting to survive against an enemy they could never have imagined. A child carried by the wave, a man floating on a bed inside his own wrecked home, a firefighter trapped by the very building meant to keep people safe. These voices from the flood echo through time, reminding us of the real human cost of that strange and terrible day. The rescue began almost immediately, but it was a nightmare. The molasses was everywhere. It was deep, thick, and incredibly sticky. It was like trying to walk through quicksand. Rescuers struggled to move through the brown goo, which was waist-deep in some places. They had to fight for every step. The cold winter air made the molasses thicken even more, making the trap even harder to escape. The cries of the injured were muffled by the sticky coating that covered everything. It was a desperate race against time, in the worst possible conditions. Firefighters and police officers arrived, joined by 100 sailors from the USS Nantucket, which was docked nearby. They waded into the mess, searching for survivors. They used rowboats to navigate the brown river that was once a street. They had to listen carefully for faint cries for help. Pulling victims out was incredibly difficult. The molasses acted like a powerful glue, holding people and animals down. It took hours to free some of the injured who were pinned by debris and trapped in the thick, viscous liquid. The rescue was slow, messy, and heartbreaking work. Once the survivors were found, the cleanup began. It was a monumental task. For weeks, workers tried to wash the molasses away. They used fire hoses to spray salt water on the streets, but it barely made a difference. The water just ran over the top of the thick syrup. They tried using sand to absorb the molasses, which helped a little. They scraped and shoveled the brown sludge into barrels and dumped it into the harbor. For months, the entire north end of Boston was a sticky, brown mess. The cleanup was a slow and frustrating process. Even after the streets were cleared, a reminder of the disaster lingered. It was the smell. For decades after the flood, residents of the North End claimed that on hot summer days, a faint, sweet smell of molasses would rise from the ground. The scent became a ghost, a sensory memory of the tragedy. It was a reminder that you can clean up the physical mess, but the memory of such an event seeps into the very fabric of a place. The long, sticky cleanup was not just about clearing the streets, it was about trying to wash away a memory that refused to disappear. After the disaster, the questions began. Who was to blame? The victims and their families wanted answers. They wanted justice. This led to one of the first and largest class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history. Over 100 separate lawsuits were filed against the owner of the tank, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The families of those who died, the people who were injured, and the owners of property that was destroyed all came together to hold the company accountable for its negligence. The legal battle would last for years. The company had a simple defense. They claimed the tank was destroyed by an act of sabotage. They argued that anarchists who were active at the time must have planted a bomb. This would mean the company was not responsible. The plaintiffs, the victims' lawyers, had a different story. They argued that the tank was poorly designed and poorly built. They said the company knew it was unsafe and did nothing. They brought in experts who testified about the thin steel, the lack of testing, and the reports of leaks and strange noises. The court appointed an auditor, Colonel Hugh Ogden, to hear the evidence. The case went on for 3 years. It was a landmark trial. For the first time, scientific and engineering experts played a major role in a legal case. They presented complex evidence about structural engineering, steel fatigue, and the effects of temperature on fermentation. Colonel Ogden listened to thousands of pages of testimony from survivors, company officials, and experts. He even visited a steel mill to understand how the tank's plates were made. It was a thorough and detailed investigation. In the end, the court found the company responsible. Colonel Ogden's final report in 1925 concluded that the tank had failed because of its own structural weakness. There was no evidence of a bomb. The company's haste and lack of care were the true cause of the disaster. United States Industrial Alcohol was ordered to pay damages to the victims, totaling about $600,000 at the time. This would be equivalent to many millions of dollars today. The case set a powerful precedent. It showed that companies could be held legally responsible for public safety. It led to new laws and regulations for construction and engineering projects, ensuring that a disaster like this would never happen again. Why do we still remember this story? It is more than just a strange historical event. The Great Molasses Flood has become a part of Boston's identity. It is a cautionary tale that is passed down through generations. It serves as a powerful reminder that progress in industry can have a dark side. It teaches us that cutting corners and ignoring warnings can lead to unimaginable tragedy. The story stays with us because it is so unusual, so visual. A wave of molasses is something you can almost see and smell in your mind. The disaster left a permanent mark, not just in memory, but on the law. The legal battle that followed helped to create modern standards for engineering and construction. Today, when a new building or a new bridge is built, it must go through rigorous inspections and testing. Engineers must sign off on the plans, taking personal responsibility for their safety. These rules were born from the wreckage on Commercial Street. The victims of the Molasses Flood did not die in vain. Their tragedy helped to build a safer world for future generations. The story also connects to our everyday lives in a simple way. The next time you pour molasses or syrup, think about its properties. It is thick, it is sticky, it flows slowly. Now imagine millions of gallons of it moving at the speed of a car. The story brings science and history into our kitchens. It takes a familiar, harmless substance and shows us the immense power it can have under the right or wrong conditions. It makes us look at the world a little differently, to see the hidden forces at play in the ordinary things around us. So, the sweet ghost of Boston lingers. It lingers in the history books, in the court records, and in the faint sweet smell that people once claimed to notice on a hot summer day. It is a story of a city, a company, and a terrible mistake. It is a story of human loss and the fight for justice. It reminds us that even the strangest disasters have real, human consequences. And it ensures that the 21 people who lost their lives on that cold January day will never be forgotten. Their memory is preserved in the story of the sticky wave that once engulfed a city.